I'm the author of this book, Administrations of Lunacy, Racism and the Haunting of American Psychiatry at the Milledgeville Asylum, which, as Mark said, took me like 15 years in all to research and write, because it's a complicated story, and I kept getting drawn back in history even as I wanted to move forward. And I thought that maybe a useful thing for me to do today, given that we're remembering Central State and we have these 5 excellent oral histories of employees to get the position of the workers, like, what does it take to tell a story? And what's the difference in a story and a history? How do you use stories? How do you tell a story? At what point do a particular set of stories rise to the occasion of official history, or how do you get those up to that? You know, how do you raise them so that people see them as a history, see themselves in history, and see history as changeable, malleable, shaped by a bunch of stuff. And I really, really appreciate your presentation this morning, Jessica, and the work that you've done on these photographs and on reconstituting, once again, the history at Central State, and your honesty in talking about your own issues. And I think that that helps us understand, too, that history is not a simple thing. Like, if as individuals we've had things happen to us, and the things I think that you enumerated, many people in the room might check some of them off, you know. So if those situations leave gaps in our memory that kind of figuring out how to fill, then this whole arc of history is going to have gaps in the memory, too. And it's going to be told from different points of view. And as feminists have shown, like, the winner tells the tale. Lillian Smith talked about that some, you know, like, so how do we tell a real history that has all of this complexity in it? And how can you use the archives, which are all those records that happened at the time, and the letters, annual reports, and people's conversations, and the tombstones, and the buildings in various states of repair, and the buzzards or the coyotes are in them now. And now they're like available, like the prison villains are available to get bought. And these buildings right here have contracts on them, and you know, what else going on now with the landscape itself, which is so compelling, and I think very feminine now. In the old days, when it was a state institution and controlled rationality and everybody got sent there, it seemed to me a very masculine affair. But this is a very feminine kind of landscape of, some ways, psychiatric ruins. Not all of it, but some of it. So how did that happen, and how did that transition happen, and what does it mean today? So those are some of the questions that I was trying to tackle. Now, why would I do that? I asked myself that a lot as the more I got into it, because it's such a huge story. Well, number one, I'm from Tuskegee, Alabama, so 30 miles from Columbus, so it's kind of Alabama on the cusp of Georgia, you might say. And I was born in 1949, and I grew up in the middle of the civil rights movement, and basically in apartheid culture, you know. But I was told by my aunt, and I was trying to figure out my family and my culture, like what's going on here. But various of us as children, when we were our more adventurous selves, would be told, you better be careful. They're going to drag you off to Bryce's. You know, and I think every state, the more I've talked about it, they'll drag you off to Jackson, they'll drag you off to whatever the name of the town is, becomes the state of a place you could get sent to. You don't know what it is, but you know it's not a good thing. You know, so it was this kind of self-policing that I internalized and carried as I grew up and realized I was lesbian. So that's one thing. And then my great aunt told me that my great-grandfather, Charles Bryce Segrest, died in Bryce's hospital in 1902. He said, deep, dark family secret, but she knew I was a writer, so she kept pumping me with his stuff. But he saw people shooting at him from trees, and he started shooting back. And she speculated that maybe it was because he was in Lee's army in Northern Virginia. Everything goes back to Civil War until it goes back further than that. And, you know, those battles there, the rivers ran red with blood. The men were devastated. They had to walk all the way home. They didn't have no car, no GPS, you know, it's just your feet. Walking to Alabama, devastated there too. Maybe he got pellagra, maybe it was PTSD, but he died within 6 months of cellulitis. which it turns out a lot of people in these hospitals did, even after they discovered the germ theory, because they kept crowding the buildings. A lot of TB, for instance, epidemically. So I had those two things. And then this book is preoccupied with race, but it's because it is my deep conviction that Southern culture is preoccupied with race. We might not talk about it. It'll be one of those gaps you're talking about, but it is. And as a writer of Southern literature, sometimes a teacher, sometimes an organizer, sometimes just poking around in archives, I wanted to understand that for my family. I knew that my great-grandfather had been in the Klan. My father was White Citizens Council, organized private schools in Alabama. And an uncle, I say of my father's, but great-uncle, shot and killed a SNCC worker in 1966 in Tuskegee. So I've had a lot of reasons to think about race. And one of the things that was compelling to me in stumbling on Central State and then starting to get interested in it is, what does it mean to found an asylum in a slave culture? Founded in 1842. So originally, I got into it too through Carson McCullers. Anybody a fan of Carson McCullers? Member of the Wedding, brilliant Georgia writer. Georgia's got much better writers in Alabama, which is one reason I have adopted Georgia. And I did go to graduate. I majored in literature and stories because I was trying to figure out the story of the South. And I went to writers, and I went to Faulkner first, and The Sound and the Fury, which is just, I kept reading the first 8, and just didn't make. It's just, I don't understand this, and finally kept on. And if you know Sound and the Fury at all, and you shouldn't know it, but it starts off in the mind of a cognitively just, a so-called idiot, someone who's developmentally disabled. There. So it was like, oh, okay, so I'll read somebody besides Faulkner. But I wanted to know the story. I wanted to tell the story, and I started through the literature, which really, Flannery shot through with it, Lillian Smith shot through it, Tennessee Williams, and all the Southern writers, if you look in the background or the foreground or something, you'll find it. In fact, Jackson's farther than crazy. That was, like Milledgeville is farther than crazy. So I wanted to figure out what's the distance to father and what's the distance to crazy. So I had those kind of more humanities stuff, not trained as a historian, but I had to figure it out, So I started somewhat naively that I would just write a piece on Milledgeville and Carson McCullers and the asylum, because in Frankie Adams, this little 13-year-old who reminded me of me, in Columbus, which was an hour away from my hometown, but 20 years earlier, was calling her cat Charles and Charlena, trying to find the cat. And her maid, Bernice Sadie Brown, said, "You better be careful. Them blue police gonna come around here and tie you up and drag you off to Milledgeville." Drag you off to Milledgeville. And one of the things it shows is like, Charles and Charlene, like, Frankie was acknowledging transgender cats, I think, And even, or maybe especially back then, that could get the police to come around here and put you, so something like that could get to you. And I was very interested, so I thought, well, I'll just write literary criticism, and I'll find the book on Central State, and I'll put those together. And I started Googling it, which you can do by 2004. And I found this article after a month from 1998 of the Consumer Council return to the museum at the train station to look at everything. Now, who's the Consumer Council? This is not Chamber of Commerce. This was a group of patients and former patients within the mental health system that were organized as part of reform to be able to give patients perspectives. And they then had visited Central State, many of whom had been not incarcerated, but patients here, but it felt like that sometimes, to give advice, so they went to the train station. And this was this beautiful article, and you just had the sense of them looking at the shock boxes, the lobotomy tools, the straitjackets, and just weeping, weeping. There was many more things in that museum. And then they went to where the graveyards were, not in these neat patterns now, were just spread in the woods or knocked aside so they could mow, and they were totally weeping by then. And that was that quotation, "This is the most gruesome sight in Georgia," that you read. It's a beautiful quotation, and as soon as I read that, the voice of it, and it was also like, it could have been us, It was devastating, it could have been us. And I just thought, shit, I gotta go. Excuse my French and raise your hand if I get too offensive, because anyway, it's a whole deal I made with God when I was protesting segregation, and I could have had sex as a 16-year-old or smoked or drank or cussed, and I decided that cussing was the safest bet. And I've been cussing ever since, right. So let me find out where I was in the story before then. Yeah, so anyway, so it's going to write about Carson and the cat and all this kind of stuff. And so I showed up down here 3 weeks after, and I was shown into the museum by the then head of human resources, who was very maxed out. So she just left me there for several days. I could have taken everything, and now I wish I had, because we don't know where it is. There was the grand piano, and the vinyl record of the Hallelujah Chorus performed by patients in the 1960s, sitting there. I always wanted that digitalized. I want to hear it. And there was the dentist chair. There wasn't just the shock boxes. There was the dentist chair. There was the nurses stuff. There was all the annual reports, kind of chalk around. There was these statues of various folks in different cultures that the pharmaceutical company somehow, or for some reason, had given Central State to try to get them to get more medication, I guess. I never quite understood that part. And there's just file cabinets worth of clippings. And so I went back and back and back, and I started just Xeroxing all the stuff, and I would leave it, and I would come back, and I'd go to, I wanted annual reports. I wanted as much of the institutional stuff, so I was doing that. So I was very shocked when the whole thing closed down. I just want to say. And one of the themes and threads that I will carry through here is the importance of history and the archives that help create it, the things that help people lift up individual stories into a framework that makes a difference. So anyway, so it came to there. And then sooner or later, I was looking for, so where's the history? Surely there's a history of this. By that time I knew it was the biggest in the world, one of those famous or infamous. Somebody got it back. Like Georgia got all these colleges, they got all these history departments. This is huge, but where's the history? Well, it wasn't, except for Peter Cranford's Milledgeville, but for the grace of God. How many people have seen that or read it or know about it? Yeah. Cranwood was the first psychologist on the staff. He was the head of psychology. He may have been the only psychologist. He lasted for 2 years because he decided that what he needed to do is build a case history of the institution. You start with a patient case history. He wanted a hospital case history. It was the Milledgeville State Hospital then. And so he got the most functional patients, of which there seemed to be a lot, and I think probably a lot of them were gay. Kind of Kafka-esque kind of thing about who was doing what jobs in the institution that had locked them up. And so they started gathering. They went up into the attics and the basements and everywhere, and they started gathering all this material from the spider webs and the squirrels and all this stuff, putting it in one place because it hadn't been accumulated that way. So the first of the historians for this institution were patients. And this doctor who was fired, that's good. That's good. Who was fired because history's dangerous in Georgia. And Superintendent Peacock, when he was sober or not, was very nervous about what might come up. So they fired him, and it took him another 20 years to self-publish. And then in the 1990s, they also self-published with the Consumer Council for money, So there was that history, but there wasn't an institutional history. So in one of my less lucid moments, I decided I'll write it. Then maybe I'll write it, like, because I know a story when I see it. And this is a hell of a story, And I've been a little girl looking for Southern stories my whole life, and this one hadn't been told. And it's very important. I mean, it's a very important story to tell the story of the largest lunatic asylum in the world, or not, and at certain points. And it was founded in a slave culture in a state capital that also administered the removal of Muskogee and Cherokee and the bringing in of African folks from North and South Carolina, because they'd been the cotton gin, and cotton was going to drive the global economy. You'll have a plantation system all the way across the South. So what does it mean in 1942 to found a lunatic asylum there? So I figured, okay, I got to go back to 1842 and tell the whole story. But then I realized Trail of Tears ended in 1838. So how can I not cover 5 years before, when the last of the Cherokees were forced out on these Trails of Tears? And so then I went back to I went back to the mastodons by the time, but somewhere in this part, I decided I had to tell the whole arc of it, whatever that would be. I had to tell the whole arc of it. And at another juncture for me, I was also collecting these fascinating stories. Like, if you got a lot of Central State stories, you're very good at a party, especially by the third cocktail. It's a lot to tell. It's a lot to tell. And so I had become, and I would start doing lectures on this, because I'm going to write this. I was still kind of going to do lyric, and then I wasn't going to do it. I was just going to write the history. Wish I had historical training, but but sometimes it gets in your way. It gets in your way. So I would be kind of like the asylum jukebox. You tell me a story, you punch a button, I'll tell you the story. And then I submitted a paper to the American Quarterly of the American Studies Association, one of the more distinguished journals, and as high on that ladder as I tried to get. And they knew my work in other ways, and they wrote me back and said, Mab, this is a fascinating story, it's very important, and we really want you to do it. But we find that you are more repeating your thesis than developing it. Now, that's a major criticism. And it was true. I found like once you start taking the pictures, once I write a sentence, it's beautiful, and I'll write the same thing again and again. And then I would just put all the sentences together and send them off. And they were saying, Ma'am, they're saying the same thing. You have to choose your sentence. And they said, by the way, you need to, but I was focusing on this amazing case history, which is one of the chapters, and I won't go too much down there, but to contextualize that, we want you to tell the history of race and psychiatry in the 19th century. Give me the paper in two months. I said, well, you took 2 years to give me back my paper. So, and I knew I couldn't do that, but I knew in 1842, this guy, Myra Brigham, who was one of the more educated of the state superintendents, the first psychiatrists were superintendents in hospitals. That's where psychiatry developed. And they had the American Journal of Insanity. So it was founded in 1842-44, same time that the asylum was founded. And also, they started having professional associations that became, down the road, American Psychiatric Association in 1921. So here's a major journal. So I went to the library, took 2 months, and it's one reason my eyes are so bad now. You can get me blinking like this, but and looked at all the tables of contents of the journal, and then printed out everything on race and some other stuff too. Wasn't that much, or slavery, because those asylum folks didn't want to talk about it because they felt like this abolition got people too excited. So all these years of psychiatry, they just had euphemisms about slavery and what happened and everything. And this is not just Southern, this is Yankees too. Yankees doing this too. So I noticed that silence, there. But I was able to construct some things enough to start to develop an argument. And when you have to develop an argument, then you have to decide what all these stories are about. Even as you're trying to find the stories and let them rise up to something, you got to figure out what they rise up to. I better go look and see what my time is. Just a minute. 25 minutes, that's good. So, as you can imagine, with all these stories, I can really go down a lot of rabbit holes. So I'm trying to stay on track. So I have to develop an argument, and I know in my heart the Southern stuff is around race and slavery, and I know I had this question about, like, what does it mean to establish a lunatic asylum in a slave culture on also land very recently dispossessed from the Muskogee and the Cherokees, with the money that comes from the sale of that land, like when fun fact, when the colony of Georgia was commissioned by whatever king was over there, we about to have one over here, I think we had one over there then, we don't and it went along the coast, and then it was like a little gun, and it went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It was 27,000 miles in Georgia. So you can't hold all that territory. You're going to have lots of wars to cut it back. You know, you are. You're going to have lots of wars to cut it back, unless where was I at that point? Oh, yeah, so how you tell the story, you know, in the state of Georgia and stuff like this. So settler colonialism is the historical framework for those colonies from Europe who come over and decide they will stay. 1776, American Revolution, we're going to stay here, no taxation, we're not going to send it over there. Of all the colonizing in the world, and by 1910, Europe controlled 80% of the world through colonization, fun fact. The settler colonists were the people where the Europeans came to stay and settle. So it's Australia, it's Canada, it's South Africa, it's United States, New Zealand, you know. So it's pretty intense when you're coming to stay. So this process of settler colonialism was that process, first in the colonies, and I was interested in Georgia too, because it's the southernmost of the 13 colonies, and it's the easternmost of the slave states. Once you start getting all the indigenous people driven out to get the land, bring all the Africans in to work it, because as Thomas Jefferson made clear, white people ain't gonna work that hard, not to do all that work. So starts going to Alabama, to Mississippi, to all those states there. So that was a framework to talk about settlement here when this, I mean, do you think this is interesting? Is this interesting? I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting. Yeah, no, it's, yeah, it's like, it explains a lot. You know, where'd the land come from? Well, they paid, the federal government had to buy back. Oh yeah, this is what that was about. Had to buy back Georgia's claim to 27,000 miles, 2,700 miles to the Pacific, you know. So all the money, you first got $1 million, which was a lot in 1817. And the first thing they did is build a penitentiary, which is where Georgia College is now, right next to the governor's mansion, which they didn't build till 1838, because that was the second installment of another $1 million, a lot of money then, to pay off the states for all the native land that the feds were taking in the West. So not only is the lunatic asylum built on native land, but it's paid for by the federal theft of native land. And so I figured, like, and then you got all the, and it's built by African slaves so that it has like the cheapest per diem in the world, which they always bragged about. We have the cheapest per capita payment in the whole world. And if you got slave labor and you've got cheap politicians, so some of the brokenness of the mental health system never wanted to pay for it, you know, never wanted to pay for it, get cheap labor and so forth, you know. So anyway, the plot gets thicker and thicker. So then I want to, and for the first 25 years, fascinating to me, like black people, they don't let black people in till emancipation, and Sherman's on the front door. And so General Sherman integrated a lot of white Southern asylums because the troops were there, and he said, you've got to do it. And so they did. So for 25 years, you got crazy white people, you know. And so I think it's very instructive to think about that. And one of my premises has always been racism hurts white people, So here's a great place to talk about all of that, because all the people being sent to the lunatic asylum by their families, by the lunacy commissions in the counties, it's liable to show up that way. But how do I get to the interior of this? Where are those stories? Where are those stories? Well, Peter Cranford published the first 33 case histories, but he summarized them. So I was thinking, where did he get them? It was from the 1845 first annual report, which I couldn't find at the Georgia archives, couldn't find here, but it turned out to be in Georgia at Hargret. And I gave a talk over there, and then I went to it, and it was there, and I got a copy. And it's like, holy cow, like, he really spills the beans on everybody. So you get, I start off with, by then I have an agent, whom I should have already fired several times. But and he wanted to reprint Memoir of a Race Trader's previous book. But then he said, well, tell me about this book. And so I started my, asylum jukebox thing. This story. He said, this sounds monumental and magisterial. And I thought, monumental, magisterial. What a book, It's like, get thee behind me, Satan, So, because it was such a huge story, and I knew I shouldn't try to tell the whole thing. There are too many different kinds of archival materials, and just a brain can only hold so much and interpret so much. But I kept getting pulled back and back and back in history to want to understand what I've just told you that you seem to think is important and has an impact now. Like a lot of the stuff today, it takes a long time to get this broken down, it does. And so I found this was insightful. And Samuel Henderson, the first guy, came to the door with his eyeball hanging out, because the Bible said, if thy eye offend thee, pluck it out. And his family, he really changed at a certain point, 1832 or something. He used to be a businessman and a church person, and he started getting just fascinated with God and praying too much and being ironic in his sensibilities, which is dangerous still, I think. And so his family put him out back, or they nailed him on a chain to a floor out back for 9 years. And then when they opened the lunatic asylum, they put him in a cart and they sent him all the way over. And somewhere along there, he pulled out his eye, which was a very literal thing to do. The Bible says, take out your eye. He took out his eye. So his eye, he should have been a little more ironic and symbolic. But anyway, I thought he was a good place to start because of this whole question of religion and the South and irony and fundamentalism. But it was a good place for him. He quieted down. He told Superintendent Green at that point, do constrain me because I'm not safe. And at a certain point he was. And he got to walk around the grounds and use the moral therapy, which was, you can have these institutions. You don't have to nail people to the floor or put them out back or whatever. But the institutions need to be therapeutic. They need to be out from town. So we're 2 miles from town, which, it's a good thing. They need to have structures. They need to have doctors who will talk to you. It's a talk therapy, which has always been a good idea. And you should stay away from your family for a while because they kind of make folks a little, if there's a dysfunction, let me say, it's going to come from family, so let's just get away. Don't read the Bible too much. Don't read the paper too much. And just kind of do stuff. And so people could go out and pick the fruits and this, that, and the other. It was kind of light work at that point because the black people hadn't got there. They got them doing the cotton when they came. So Samuel Henderson. Or I really loved, let me see what her name was. Moore, something, I've got it written down, but it's dropped on the floor. But she was in Cherokee County, and they picked her up and brought her, but she had been walking all over. She was just a traveler, and she talked the blue streak. She talked up, down, and sideways. And she was always telling the story of Indian insurrections and Indian wars and volcanoes, and it was like she was the NPR of settler colonialism. So I thought she was one of my favorite people She got all the stuff out of, they got all the stuff out of her hair. They let her walk. But they had some good things were happening for some people. But the problem there was the theory of medicine at that time was called heroic medicine. And you had different bodily humors, and you just had too much going on, and so they needed to drain your system. They did it by bleeding, if you remember those leeches, and they did it by purging, which was diuretics to have, and nauseants. So you can imagine going at both ends is going to quiet people down. But if you don't yet know the germ theory of disease, and you're not yet attuned to bodily fluid is dangerous, you're going to have some epidemics too. So a lot of people died of those things. So the theory of medicine was working against the theory of psychiatry, which was like, you know, be in a calm place. And yet you had this bleeding and purging and stuff. And so that was where, that wasn't a bad intention of the institution or the people working in it. It was just like bad thinking, you know, that you couldn't do anything about. So it were those kind of things that I wanted to tell the story of. Germ theory did come along in 1870, but Georgia was so, by that time, emancipation, Georgia was so, people at the Georgia Asylum were so concerned with how crazy black people were. And they attributed that not to lynching, not to slavery, not to sharecropping, not to all those things that were getting inflicted on black people in the beginnings of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, but the fact that, well, one of the main topics of conversation, 1895, and this is one of those shocking things in the archive, you just have to go outside and stamp some and come back. They had all the different individual conversations, and then all the Southern psychiatrists met at night to discuss the topic, was emancipation prejudicial to the Negro? And they said yes. They all agreed. That was their solution. Even as tuberculosis, if you listen to the germ theory of disease, would spread in overcrowded wards. And the legislature was still not giving anybody enough space. So lots of folks coughing would spread tuberculosis, and they were starting to have in the 1990s epidemics of tuberculosis, so that half the people who got TB would bring it there, but half the people would catch it in the institution. And they knew enough, if they had been studying the right things, besides emancipation, to just wanted to build more buildings, you know, put all the black people in one building, got bigger and bigger and bigger, the colored building, then it caught on fire. And fortunately, nobody was killed in the fire, but it was terrifying. Now, when there was a fire in Ohio and people got burned, white people got burned out there, they put them in churches, you know, they took them into people's homes. But here, they put the black people, the 900 black people who had been accumulated in one building, because they didn't want to build separate asylums, could be too expensive. They put them in the jails. Apparently there's tunnels underneath here somewhere, put them in some tunnels, you know, like, until they could rebuild a very fine building because they had insurance, and then they built the surgical theater in the front of it to do operations of a special class, which was sterilization. You know, and at that point, I just thought, I don't know if I should be writing this stuff down, you know, like, it just, you know, it's just, the plot was very thick around all that. And for some of y'all who read the book, you might think I shouldn't either. Like, I really sympathize with, you know, like Toni Morrison in Beloved at the end of it. It's like, how do you tell a story that nobody wants to tell and nobody wants to hear, you know? How do you tell this story, you know? So that became a lot of my methodology, always looking, though, for the counter stories. I mean, there was this wonderful, gotta look at my time again, wonderful kindergarten teacher who got committed. Husbands were committing a lot of women in their 50s for some reason and letting them out in their 60s for some, or maybe 40s, you know, if you know what I mean, you know. So Mamie Bonner got in there, kindergarten teacher, and she looked around and she saw all the cognitively disabled children for whom nothing was being done. And she wanted to teach them. And so she started gathering them together. And somewhere around here, she had a little school in a little room. And she taught them the alphabet and coloring and all this kind of stuff, and she treated them as if they could learn, and they did. And it was so successful that the administration gave them a little house, and other patients wanted to volunteer and other staff wanted to volunteer, and they were doing 35 or 50 students there who could then go home and be functioning in their communities. And they had all these, I mean, I just imagine like the pictures on the wall, and, you know, like they did it. They did it because they needed to, and they had the, and they let them do it. So it was this really beautiful and heartening example for me that we can create micro-sanity, you know what I mean? And we might need to really perfect some of these skills. Like in a small area, somebody with skills can set a different energy that other people are drawn into that rehabilitates these little people, you know? So I think that was very inspiring. Don't you think that's inspiring? Yes, me too. And then the other thing that happened about the same time, whole pellagra epidemic. I got about 8 more minutes, so I'm trying to get in. Pellagra epidemic. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was terrifying because nobody knew what it was. They had just finally figured out, oh, germs, it could be germs, but it wasn't. How did it spread? And it was it was called the butterfly disease. And it was just splotches, and then it would be like syphilis. It just kind of, it was bad. It was like AIDS, terrifying. And they needed to figure it out. And it was especially in institutions, mental institutions, orphanages, and so forth, and in some mill villages. And so this guy, Joseph Goldberger, had just started working for the new U.S. Public Health Service. And so he came to Milledgeville. So Dr. Goldberger's still walking around there somewhere, you know. And he was at, you know, like, he wasn't trying to figure out if emancipation was prejudicial to patients. He wanted to know what vitamins were. I mean, he was at the other end. He was at the top end of the medical profession. And there was this new word called vitamine. And they knew that there could be particular kinds of starvations for not your whole body, but, you know, like vitamin B, D. I mean, we have all these vitamins now, and we know you take a bunch of D, this kind of stuff. And so he felt like it was a nutritional deficiency. But the staff said, oh, no, we all eat the same thing. We all eat the same thing. But he said, yeah, well, we'll see. Because he was trained in New York. He was an Austrian immigrant. He was a Jew. So he did not bring the plantation mentality into the institution. He wanted to see for himself. And what he saw was the superintendent went first, and then the staff, and then the doctors, then the nurses, then the patients who were white, and blah, 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 you know, like, and by the time you got to the end, wasn't a lot of food. Or if patients were very excitable, they were eating each other's, and so people were starving within the institution. So Dr. Goldberger did what is still now one of the most famous examples of epidemiology in the books. 6 minutes, in the books. So he thought, who are the group of people, we should think this today, who are the group of people who don't have pellagra? And what he said, the diet of the well-to-do. It's the well-to-do who don't have pellagra. It's the people confined. So he said, what would happen if we would feed them the diet of the well-to-do? And he persuaded, and he got federal money. And bless his heart, he chose 2 wards, both women, 1 white and 1 black. He wasn't speculating, well, emancipation done ruined all y'all, we might as well do it. You know, like, he fed black and white women the same diet of well-to-do. Very emancipatory guy. One of my favorites of all times. And lo and behold, they didn't get sick. You know, folks would get sick from summer, and this is white people, this is black people. You know, it happens in white people, it happens in black people. You know, it's like, once you get in this, and one of these systems, they ain't gonna pay for anything. So people would get sick, but they didn't get sick on the diet of the well-to-do. And later on, he and this guy, Streichenberger, did a study of the mill villages in the South, because all the mill factories had coming down from the north because they were unionizing, cost too much, so we'll go south where it's cheap labor, everything's cheap down here, yay, 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 still is. And so they built these mill villages for white workers, and black people could work with white people in mill villages. And some of the mill villages had very high levels of pellagra, and some didn't. So he's wondering why. And he found, and this was like the white people who were moving off the farms and agriculture out of the mountains down into industrial work. But back home, they had pigs, they had chickens, they had watermelon, they had corn, they had peas, they had beans, they had gardens. But once you got in these mill villages, you were working dawn to dusk, and in some of these villages, cotton is growing up to the back step, cotton. And so you don't have the space, and so those were the most afflicted mill villages, is the ones where there was no space for gardens or any of that stuff. And so they made the recommendations like clear out space, let people have gardens, let people have pigs. I mean, you can eat every single thing on a pig except the hoof, and you can try to do that. It's a poor person's animal, because anybody had chitlins here? Like, you have to know who cooked the chickens. That's what you don't want to eat chitlins that somebody else cleaned. You have a couple bad nights there, but anyway. So like you could do these reforms, and they also said like you need to raise people's wages. So if you gave people the diet of the well-to-do, and you had, like you had work conditions that were decent, then people wouldn't get sick. And then they later on figured out it wasn't just vitamins, it was niacin, vitamin B so-and-so. So if you gave people brewer's yeast, for instance, in constricted conditions, they wouldn't get pellagra, so they cured pellagra. At Milledgeville, they figured it out. They also did some stuff down at Mississippi, the white men in prisons, but I don't have time to tell you that, so you should read the book. And in terms of like where my stories intersect with these stories here, I wanted to do this at the beginning, I'll do it at the end. And also, don't let me forget to tell you about the flowers and the Hallelujah Chorus in Haunting in History. So, all of these folks and this symposium, and people in Milledgeville rightfully are proud of the work that people in this generation and memory cohort did here. Proud of what you gave the patients, 3 cots and a hot, three hots and a cot, and I talked to a lot of folks myself. Number one, I did not write this part of the history. Number one, my brain was like broke, my eyes are already broke, but I also knew that it was it's decentralization, it's all of those things. Before then, you had one institution in one place, and it's one story, and I told that story as well as I could, and y'all can Amazon and get the book, and, I'm sorry there's not copies here. Where was I? So why it's not inconsistent. But, I didn't write that part of the story, and I knew that I couldn't because it just spread to the winds, which is what many of you have heard, and I agree, were really heartbroken when all of Central State closed down, even though it was under federal court order, even though there had been investigations by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution of all the mental health systems on the number of folks who were dying in them. So it didn't get solved, it didn't get solved, But people were working on that, and people were doing their best, and I talked to Superintendent Mims, I talked to Head Martha Colvin, I talked to a bunch of people, and what they said were, we were in this institution that we knew had this history, we were working our butts off to bring it up to human rights standards, and we were almost there. But the more we did those reforms, the fewer patients there were, and the more the budgets were cut. So that experience that many people had in a positive way, although not 100% positive, it's not going to be, I think, in the mental health system, was I think, also due to reforms in the administration and reforms in Georgia. Some Vander whatever started in 50, the Carters did that. Rosalind Carter's got that legal bill passed in '79, and Reagan came in and cut all the budgets. Kennedy, because his sister Rose got lobotomized, had a mental health program in '63 because they had these miracle drugs, which turned out had to have more side effects. I got 2 more, I'm gonna give myself 2 more minutes. This is my grandson. He wants to, we gotta do, we'll do 3 more minutes. You know, with all these reforms, but they were undercut by the next administration. And the 1,500 healthcare centers that Kennedy's bill would have put across the country, they were all cut, they were never built. And so you have deinstitutionalization, you have a rise in mass incarceration, so that 10 of these buildings become 5 maximum security. And if you want to ride down there and see some haunted territory, you look at all of that barbed wire and buildings, which is now available. And these have been like sold, you know, and I think that's great. But I want to say that, like, there's 25,000 bodies in the woods, 35,000 now. You can't ignore that, you know, we can't ignore that, or this prison history, but you can turn it into, you know, like one of those prison buildings could be a museum around mass incarceration. You know, I tried to argue when I was here on the Newell residency that this place, that the Powell building could become a center for human rights and psychiatry. I couldn't, and you could have got, Georgia College could have gotten that building for $1. It's too expensive, I guess. But you know, they weren't interested in it, you know. But that still needs to happen, and I think also that all of this renaissance and renovation is not going to happen until deeply, deeply people confront the history. And this does not mean that all of you who work your hearts out for the people who were incarcerated here, who were patients here, let me say, because they didn't have a family and you were their family. Richard Brookins was a good friend of mine, explained that to me. I will keep coming back, I have a family that don't. All of that is true. All of this can be true at the same time. But underneath that, there's bodies in the woods. And so the 2 things I want to tell you about, which are Flowers and Hallelujah Chorus, we have, is things that, as I was in this conversation, 2 northern states with these bad psychiatric histories, because all the states had it, shame of the states, what they did, and I can't remember, I don't know which one I like the best, but I'll start with the Flowers. They were going to tear this building down. But before they did that, they decided to put different kinds of flowers in every single room and invite any patient, anybody who wanted to come back, anybody who had had a hard history here, to come back and tour with the flowers. And they had to get, so they got flowers from all over the world to come at the same time and bloom, which they managed to do. So all of a sudden, then they had this one day where people could assemble there and tour this floral, like, who did the floral interview? Tour an asylum building that had been turned into just a huge bouquet of flowers from all over the world with all the scents and colors and everything. And then they could take them out and they tore it down. But there had been a resolution, and there had been beauty. Like, beauty will cover a lot of stuff. Sometimes it's not that expensive. Kindness will too, and that's really cheap if you really have the guts to do it. The other one, though, I even like better. They put a sound system with, what's it, you know, like, oh damn, I can't, you know, like the thing that projects the sound, the speakers, yes, in every room. Every room of this hospital building was wired as a speaker, so the whole thing was going to be a sound system. Everybody came that day, prayed a little bit, walked around in a circle, and they played the Hallelujah chorus through the whole building. So it's a different vibration, you know, like, and it was an acknowledgement that something happened here, and we memorialize it. And we can turn it into beauty, and then we'll tear it down, but we're not pretending anything. And I think that this place needs that. You know, something like that. Doesn't have to be everything, but something like that, even as you proceed with the history, which you also need to preserve. And we don't know where the history is from, we don't know where all the stuff is. from the former museum down the old Capitol that Betty Snyder worked so hard on with those gorgeous stolen artifacts from indigenous people. Where are they, you know, when that closed up? Where's all that stuff? Or where's the stuff that was in the train station museum that I could have stolen and I didn't? You know, like, but it's in boxes, and we know there's a bunch of them down in the bottom of the library because Holly showed them to me, and they don't know, you know, like there's a lot of stuff we don't know about. There's a grand piano, there's all that stuff that I saw there, and you need to know where it is for Jessica and y'all to do this business, and extra 2 minutes, and the state of Georgia paid $9 million to renovate the governor's mansion, which was operational from 1838 to 1868, when the capital went to Georgia, to the lament of Milledgevillians even to today. There's not a state capital. $8 million, $9 million, and this place is falling apart. Now the Heritage Museum, as I understand it, needs $4 million to rebuild and have a place for all of this stuff and not have to just in the corners. And they need to get that money, and they need to find where those boxes are and where the piano is and where all that stuff is. And you know, Edwin, you said you had a inventory all the stuff there, and we need to publish it and check it off. And who got this stuff? Who got this stuff? You know, like, because that helps these individual stories rise to the point of a larger story. And it's all these gaps that we can have not only in our family history, our personal history, but also in our collective history. And this is a very, very important history here that you have a part of, and Milledgeville a special part, and cashed in on all those jobs, which were really great. But it's a story for the people of Georgia because it reached into every kinship network in this state who sent family here over the years in profound ways. Some of them I can tell you a bunch of stories about that too. I'm not going to do that, you know. So I think it deserves the history, and I'm really appreciative of this event today, and I'm glad I got invited. Wasn't sure I wasn't going to get run out of town on rails at some point, you know, and I'll do anything I can to really institutionalize this and find those boxes and find all that stuff and build the arc of the narrative for this part of it that also honors the workers and the patients and the families, everybody but politicians. Thank you very much.